All right, it's Middle Ground with Carlos Curbelo. Carlos, thank you so much for doing this, as always.
Thank you, Seth. It's good to be back together.
So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a cliffhanger. You and I were going to talk about guns this time. We're going to do that next time. So stay tuned.
Hunt.
In the meantime, exactly. In the meantime, we usually do that anyway, right?
Yeah.
In the meantime, I just went down to DC and I spoke with some of your friends and former colleagues. And so I wanted to tell you what I heard.
So hold on, you weren't subpoenaed, right? You went
I was
voluntarily.
not subpoenaed.
Okay.
No.
Good.
And it was while it was all public. It was a public setting. It was behind closed doors, but everybody's going to hear about it.
Okay, not classified. Okay.
Not classified, indeed. So I wanted to the goal here is I'm going to tell you what I heard, and then you can maybe translate, right?
I'll try.
So I'm going to anonymize everyone's feedback with the exception of Don Young, right?
He's always on the record. He's not shy at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are all podcasts, so they'll all come out. But I'm saying for the ease of use of this conversation.
Okay.
So the number one thing that we talked about was the celebration of passing the Safe Banking Act. And we talked about what might happen in the Senate. Since it was only Congress people that I spoke to, meaning I did not speak to senators, so I don't have both points of view, we decided, well, we'll leave that for a conversation with a senator, if not the leader himself, right? So that was that. Do you agree with that? That is there some world in which the House has the ability to influence Senate legislation in any real way, to influence a vote?
Yeah, personal relationships. So members in the House from states where this is a priority obviously are in a good position to reach out to those Senate offices and ask for at least a fair hearing on this. And by the way, it looks like that's going to happen. Senator Crapo, who leads Senate banking, has said that he wants to move this legislation of this nature. I don't know if it'll be the Safe Banking Act exactly,
right?
But this is on a fairly good track. I usually pessimistic about any legislation moving in Washington, which makes sense. Yeah. But we have what looks like an exception here.
If you're reading the tea leaves at this point in time, do you see a vote before Election Day 2020? Understanding the podcast line knows no time and that we're talking in late 2019?
Yes. I could see a vote in the next 2-3 months. I could see a vote next summer. I could see a vote at the end of next year in a lame duck session, perhaps. This is in pretty good shape, and the fact that the House vote was so overwhelming.
Yep.
321, I think, was the number, with the House Republican leader voting for it. There's a compelling case here. It certainly has momentum.
Okay, so we'll leave that there. We'll come back to it. Because now we'll talk about the States Act. And when we were at the end of the year last year, every business person that I spoke to was sure that we would be passing the States Act. Now, when I went down, and you're smiling and laughing.
Business people think very logically. That's a big mistake in Washington.
They've got the Aristotle, input on logic, and that's a different world. Understood. So, when I brought up the States Act this time, and again, I spoke to Republicans and Democrats, and this cannabis issue is a great one because it doesn't matter what your political philosophy is. We've got kind of everybody on board here for every different reason. We've talked about that in the past. Mm-hmm. However, the States Act, when that came up in conversation, no matter Democrat or Republican, what was brought up instead was the MORE Act. You're familiar with the MORE Act. It's been introduced bicamerally in the House by Chairman Nadler, in the Senate by Kamala Harris. And what it does is take cannabis off of the Controlled Substances Act 1970. Fantastic. unfortunately, for vote's sake, is the only reason I say unfortunately, my conversations had it as a bill that wouldn't be supported. So you can listen to the interviews that come out on the podcast, but former prosecutor, well, now I guess I'll just name him, Congressman Dave Joyce, had an issue actually with the expungement piece. He says, if you only do something once, you can get that taken off your record. That's fine. If you do something twice, that's why you need it expunged from your record. And I, as a prosecutor, have a problem with, you did something twice, knowingly breaking the law twice. Why should I expunge that from your record, no matter if it's legal now or not?
So let's set aside the merits of any of these arguments for a second, or really permanently. We don't need to get into that because that's a separate conversation.
Fine.
The bottom line is that the MORE Act, even if you and I were to agree that it is wonderful legislation, is not viable in this Congress.
Now, tell me why it's not viable. They told me why it's not viable. From Carlos Curbelo's perspective, why is it not viable?
The United States Senate will not take it up. They won't consider it. They won't even debate it. I mean, a lot of them probably have never even heard of it, and they're not interested in finding out about it.
If for no other reason, because it has that big 5% tax, right?
Well, that's a part of it. But look, there are three bills. There's the Safe Banking Act, which is modest. It is narrow. It exclusively deals with the issue of the industry's access to banking. And that's not unimportant. I mean, that's a major problem for the industry. It increases the cost of operating. The industry doesn't have access to traditional lending. In some cases, people are still walking around with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. That's dangerous.
It's a public safety issue.
Safe Banking Act seeks to address that.
Indeed.
Then there's this, middle ground piece of legislation, which is appropriate for our conversation here, which is states, which goes a little further. It takes care of the banking issue, but it just essentially defers to states on any substantive matter with regards to cannabis. So it fixes the tax inequity, and it essentially says the federal government will respect a decision of all states. So if Alabama calls the feds and says, we need help enforcing prohibition here in our state, the feds will help.
Yep.
And if Colorado says, please leave us alone, we have this under control, the feds will step back.
There you go.
And then there's the MORE Act, which is even more ambitious and says, well, we're not just going to defer to states. We're going to change federal law, and we're going to have aggressive, expansive social equity provisions that seek to do right by the many people, the many victims of federal prohibition over the decades. And I certainly think there's merit to that. But again, that's kind of irrelevant for the sake of discussing what's viable.
There we go.
That's even though for you and I, for everyone who watches this programming, there's a lot of consensus, and we know that we're on the right side of history, that there's not consensus in that regard in the U.S. Senate. In the House, as you heard from one of the from the leading sponsor on the Republican side of the States Act, there's not consensus on MORE Act provisions. So politics is the art of the possible. We need to get, I propose we should try to get as much as we can, versus the approach of saying, hey, if we can't get everything we want, no one's going to get anything.
Right.
I remind people, States Act would make a big difference, perhaps not for the victims of prohibition over the decades yet, but certainly for the 200,000 employees that work in the industry today, their families who depend on them for that income. Look, this is our democracy. It's not a parliamentary system where It's easy to get consensus. Well, the UK,
That's a whole different conversation.
The UK is showing that that's not necessarily true anymore. Or a dictatorship where one guy says or one woman says this is what we're doing, and that's it. No, we have to take steps here, and I think the Safe Banking Act is an obvious step. It has a lot of support right now, and I think that broad support for the Safe Banking Act shows that the States Act is very likely viable as well.
So there you have it. And what was concerning to me is that we, with the MORE Act, if let's just assume that we didn't mean to, but what we did was we overlaid politics over policy, and in doing so, made the policy opaque, meaning the States Act conversation was replaced with the MORE Act conversation, so that we are no longer having the States Act conversation. If we could have both conversations at the same time, okay, fine. But one replaced the other, and then now we can't do either in the House, which is what, and that's why I brought up the expungement piece. It's like we didn't even get past the expungement piece in the MORE Act. That's so that's an issue. That's what brings me to my conversation with Don Young. You remember Don Young. There is only one Don Young.
Unforgettable.
So his point to me was, it doesn't matter that the States Act has been replaced by the MORE Act in conversation. We shouldn't do anything. Meaning that because the Safe Banking Act has banking in the title, and as you mentioned, had over 70% support in the House and all sorts of people that would never vote on any other standalone cannabis legislation. His point is, you don't do anything else in the House until that gets passed in the Senate. Because when that gets passed in the Senate, then you can do something else. But you can't do anything else until that, because then you water down, essentially, the votes that have come with that Safe Banking Act. What are your thoughts on that? I thought that was fascinating.
I think Don Young, who is the Dean of the House, the member who's been there the longest, understands how the process works.
Excuse me, 40 years.
If SAFE passes the Senate, goes to the president's desk, and gets signed, that builds a lot of momentum for this cause. Members will have seen that they supported legislation, they voted for it, nothing bad happened to them. On the contrary, people are probably going to thank them. And that builds confidence and momentum and allows people to look at the next step. But as long as nothing happens, or as long as we're fighting for the perfect, then things just kind of become stagnant. And what we can't do in this whole process is what happens in our politics at the national level. And it's why the system's so broken. All the people in the middle, and we are middle ground here, get ignored for the extremes. And the two extremes end up fighting, and no one gets anything. And that's been the case for every major policy area, just about, for the last decade plus. Immigration, guns, the environment, the fiscal crisis, Social Security, Medicare, no action. Is that what we want for cannabis?
Perfect.
Do we want to be debating this same question in 10 years? We can. We can. It's happened to every other issue.
Yep.
Or we can look at the exceptions, like criminal justice reform, where at the end of the last Congress, we had a wonderful bipartisan vote. Some conservatives were a little uncomfortable with it, but voted for it. There are a lot of liberals who wanted a lot more. Yet they said, okay, this is going to help some people. It's not going to help all the people we want to help, but it's going to help some of those people. So let's do that. And then next year we'll try to get more. That's it. I mean, that's the only way.
And what you're saying, perfect being the enemy of the good, right? So without iterative change, we have no change. And if you're a cannabis person, I'm not talking to you. meaning you are not the you in this situation. If you're a cannabis person, you could probably also be a gay marriage person, and gay marriage came, to us. There is complete change with gay marriage. It came to us through iterative change. And with the iterative change, we didn't just stop. We did get, complete change. And those two issues are compared often.
That's a good example. It was civil unions first, and that allowed people to, have the types of relationships that they were seeking or get closer to that. And it was a good step, and it didn't hurt anyone. And ultimately we got equality, which was the goal. But had people stood up and said, no, we're not going to do anything here until we get everything we want, we may not be at the point where we are today in American history, where people are accepted in terms of their relationships, regardless of what the nature of those are.
Yeah, I think maybe we can take as guidance teleportation, right? So until teleportation is a reality for our society, maybe we should move forward one step at a time, because that's how.
Yeah, I agree with that. And here's one more thing I'll add.
Yeah,
it's usually, you look at history, the conservative parties versus progressive parties. It's usually the progressive parties that are looking to change policy, right? To get to a different outcome or a different situation than the one we're in today.
Indeed.
In this battle between the perfect and nothing and no change always wins.
Right.
No change always wins. Those who want to see no action always have the advantage, especially in divided government, especially in a government like the one the founding fathers designed, where the system has a bias for no action. So this is advice for everyone on how to move forward on this issue, but especially for our progressive friends. If you get into this paradigm where you will only accept everything you want, you're probably going to get nothing. And that's a victory for the people who are fighting for no movement, no action.
That is the lesson here. That's absolutely the lesson here. Because in going for perfect, you lose the middle, and then you agree with the antithesis of what you want.
I tell people the extreme liberals and the extreme conservatives, they all meet in the same place, and the rest of us just watch them beat each other up, and it's not fun.
Well, exactly. Usually when you see some sort of epic battle, it's, interesting to watch, like McEnroe and whatever. I'm not a tennis guy. Connors, there was that one year. Oh my God, look at these two giants going at it. But this is not fun to watch them go.
No, this is different.
Carlos Curbelo, thank you so much. This is the insight we were looking for. I can't wait till the next time.
Thank you, Seth.